So the reason that you get this water flowing the opposite direction is because so much of it piles up over here. So there's such a large amount of warm water that's pushed from east to west that it forms a hill, a topographic hill, where you get movement that flows downhill due to gravity. So you can think about it like a slight slushing back. So most of it gets pushed to the west, but a little bit will flow back the opposite way due to gravity and due to it piling up over here in the West Pacific. Okay, so now we can get into a little more detail of the exact geometry of the direction that ocean currents move when compared with the wind direction. So remember that I said in one of the first couple slides is that surface currents are controlled by the wind, the main wind direction, but they don't exactly parallel that wind direction. And that's because of the Coriolis effect. So because of that, surface currents will move at a slight angle to the main wind direction. So in this diagram here, we can see we have the wind is blowing due north. And so the deflection, if you're in the northern hemisphere, is going to be to the right. And at the surface, it's to the right 45 degrees from the main wind direction. So there's a 45-degree difference between the two. Current speed also decreases with depth. So the deeper you go, the slower the speed of the water will be. Whereas the effect related to the Coriolis effect, right, that increases with depth. So the curvature or the deflection due to the Coriolis effect increases with depth. And the result of those two things here, the result is called the EKMAN spiral. And the EKMAN spiral describes the speed and direction of seawater flow at different depths. So when we look at this slide here, this is a representation of the EKMAN spiral. So here's the main wind direction at the surface. The ocean current right at the surface will be 45 degrees to the right if it's in the northern hemisphere. But as you increase with depth, notice that arrow starts to turn. All right, so these are vectors, which means that each arrow displays two pieces of information. The length of the arrow is the speed of the water, and the direction the arrow is pointing is the direction the water is moving. So you can see with increasing depth, the current speed slows. You get shorter and shorter arrows, and the arrow starts to spin because of the increased effect of the Coriolis effect with depth. So due to the EKMAN spiral, you could have a deep ocean current, a bottom current that moves opposite to the wind direction, right? That's totally possible. And this spiral leads to something called EKMAN transport, right? So because of this spiral, the net transport will be 90 degrees, right? To the right in the northern hemisphere, or 90 degrees to the left of the wind direction in the southern hemisphere. So you can see from this diagram here at the surface, the current is moving 45 degrees from the wind, and the overall net transport will be 90 degrees from the main wind direction. The EKMAN spiral leads to something called geostrophic flow. So because EKMAN transport piles up water within these subtropical gyres. So remember, the gyre is the large circular loop of moving water. And so because of the EKMAN spiral, water piles up in these gyres, and a center or a hill, a raised sea surface, forms as a result. And so because of that, because of gravity, you're going to get a downward flow around that center, that elevated center. And the flow will also, due to the Coriolis effect, you will also have it be deflected to the right. So because of that, you get something called geostrophic flow. And that's the balance of downhill and clockwise motion that causes this flow around the hill of water. So when you look at this picture here, you can see here the green lines are the wind belts. Right? So you can see surface water is following the major wind belts here. And you also have these lines. Right? So this is the direction that seawater is moving. And notice that on this side, the lines are closer together, right? And on this side, there's more space between each line. And this means that you have a faster flowing current on this end and a slower moving current on this end. And that's because the center has been deflected, right? So it's lagging behind due to the rotation of Earth. So because Earth rotates towards the east, right, the center of your gyre is going to be pulled to the west here. And every gyre experiences this because every gyre is on Earth and is influenced by the rotation of Earth. So this leads to special properties of currents that are on the western boundary and on the eastern boundary. So geostrophic flow within these gyres is what controls how fast or how slow and the temperature of these ocean currents. So western boundary currents, these are going to be faster, they're going to be narrower, they're going to be deeper, and these are also going to be your warm ocean currents. The eastern boundary currents of every gyre are cold. They're slow moving, they're much shallower, and they're wider. And so that you can look at each gyre in our ocean, right? And we can compare that. And so we'll look at a map of this, but make sure you know all four of these for each, western and eastern. This will be on your test. You'll have to know the differences between these two and what causes that, the difference. Okay, so why do we care about the temperature of ocean currents? So we care because warm ocean currents will warm the air at the coast. This leads to warm, humid air and a humid climate on the adjoining landmass. Cold ocean currents, which are these blue arrows here, cold ocean currents, they cool the air, right? So the air is dry, and so on the adjoining landmass, you have a dry climate. So here we are in Southern California. We have a blue current, and I think we can all agree it's pretty dry here. Whereas over here on the East Coast, they have a warm ocean current, right? They have the Gulf Stream. And so you may know if you've ever been to the Southeast, it's very humid, right? There's a lot of moisture in the air, and that's due to this warm ocean current, right? That's due to the Gulf Stream here. And the reason we have a warm ocean current here is due to geostrophic flow. So we also have to discuss movements that are not horizontal. So in the ocean, we also get two types of movement called upwelling and downwelling. So upwelling is where you have seawater that comes from depth. It's usually colder and nutrient rich, and it rises up to basically fill in the space and replace the diverging surface water. And the cold bottom water, it's more nutrient rich because it's sweeping up all the dead organisms that leads to areas of high biological productivity. So where you have areas of upwelling, you know you're going to have abundant marine life. It's sort of like the all-you-can-eat buffet. And one really famous example of upwelling is at the equator. So remember, because of the trade winds, the north and south equatorial current both move from east to west, right? They both move from east to west, and because of that, the movement away means that water has to rise up to fill in the space, right, from the water that's moved away. So that's called upwelling. And usually you have a very high, areas of high biological productivity. And there also tend to be areas where you have a lot of fishing industries are built at coasts that are famous for upwelling. Downwelling is the opposite. So this is where surface waters converge, right? So you have ocean currents meeting at a point as opposed to moving away from each other. So where surface currents converge, water piles up, and you can see it forms that hill, right? And so the seawater has nowhere to go, so it moves downward, right, due to gravity. And these zones are associated with low biological productivity. So this wouldn't be an area where you'd have a big fishing industry. This would be sort of a ghost zone. So now let's look at this map here and see if we can try to identify any areas where we could see downwelling. So downwelling is where ocean currents converge against each other. So let's see. We have one right here. The North Pacific and the Alaska current are meeting. They're converging to a point. So you might have a zone of downwelling here. We have a zone of downwelling here. We have two currents meeting over here in the southern hemisphere. Here we have another zone, another downwelling. So I won't expect you to memorize all the names of the currents or anything like that, but you should understand the basics of why, a cold water current creates a dry climate and a warm water current creates a humid and warm climate. So you should be able to remember those connections and be able to apply them. Okay, so here we have a diagram that is demonstrating once again this thing called EKMAN flow. So here we are looking in the northern hemisphere, right? So that means that due to the Coriolis effect, things will be deflected to the right. So here we have a coastline and we have wind blowing due north. We know from a couple slides ago that the EKMAN transport is 90 degrees from the wind direction. All right, so here we can see that would mean we would have flow to the right and towards the coastline. So where you have EKMAN transport meeting a coastline, you have an area of downwelling. This water has no place to go, so it goes down. But let's say you had wind blowing from the opposite direction, right? Let's say you had a wind belt that always blew from north to south, right? You would know that the flow would be to the right of that direction. So now you get flow away from the coast. So as water leaves the coast, deep bottom water has to come up to fill in the space. So you get a zone of upwelling. So the direction of wind belts controls whether you get upwelling or downwelling on a coastline. So oceanography is very important to understanding how our world works. And when we know that things are changing, like the direction of wind belts, right, we can think about all the other changes and effects that will apply because of that. So in the southern hemisphere, these two pictures would be the opposite, right? So make sure that you also remember that the hemisphere you're in is very important. So these next couple slides are focusing on some of the other currents, some of the other famous currents on Earth. And I won't expect you to know all of them, but I would like you to know about the Antarctic circumpolar current. Right? So this is a really important one because it encircles Earth and transports more water than any other current. Right? So you can see that demonstrated here. And this is also where we have some of the strongest winds on our planet. So make sure you know this one for your test. Here we have a map of the North Atlantic Gyre. So a couple slides ago, we looked at the main 5 gyres. And this map just kind of zooms in on a little more of the detail, right? Because it's not just one circle, right? Of course, it's always a little bit more complex. So each side of the gyre has, minor sub-gyres here. And you can see the thickness of each current, right? The thickness of each current, the boldness of it tells you the speed, right? So you can see the fastest moving current here is the Gulf Stream, right? So this comes up here around Florida and then follows up the east coast of North America. And then on the other sides, right, we have our North Equatorial Current. On the eastern boundary current, we have the Canary Current. So remember, thinking back to our gyres and geostrophic flow, our western boundary current is going to be our warm water current, and our eastern boundary current is going to be our cold water current. So that means cold water current, dry climate on this coast. Warm water current, humid, warm climate on this coast. Here we have the South Atlantic subtropical gyre. So this consists of the Brazil current here, the Antarctic circumpolar current, the Benguela current, and also the South Equatorial current. So it has those 4 sides. The western side has the warm water current. The eastern side has the cold water current. The cold water current is going to be slower, and the warm water current is going to be faster. Now let's look at a picture of the Gulf Stream, right? So previously I said it's a warm water current. It moves very fast, and it's one of the best studied. And one of the reasons for that is because of these really unique biological populations that inhabit these cold and warm water eddies. And these eddies form in a really interesting way in basically when you have an intersection or a convergence between contrasting temperatures of seawater. The boundary between those two, so here you have warm water, here you have cold water, and that sharp contrast can sometimes create these curves or meanders, kind of like you'd see a meandering river like the Mississippi River. And occasionally one of these meanders will break off and form these features called eddies. And I'll show you a picture of the NASA image of some of these eddies in the Gulf Stream. It's pretty amazing at the structure of some of these things. Okay, so let's just have a look at this figure again here, right, from your textbook. So the Gulf Stream warms the east coast of the US and also northern Europe. The North Atlantic and Norwegian currents warm northwestern Europe. The Labrador current cools eastern Canada, and the Canary current cools North Africa. So you don't have to memorize this. All you need to understand is the geometry of gyres, these circular loops of water, and you need to understand how geostrophic flow will dictate which current will be which temperature. So remember, western currents are warm and fast, eastern currents are cold and slow. And if you know that, then you can tell me on the test what type of climate you'd have on a particular region. Here we have the Pacific Ocean. So here's the North Pacific gyre rotating to the right and the South Pacific gyre rotating to the left. The South Pacific gyre has the East Australian current, the Antarctic circumpolar current, the Peru current, and the South Equatorial current. So which current in the South Pacific gyre would you expect to be the warm water current? Did you say the East Australian current? Well, good job. The Peru current is a cold ocean current, so it contributes to a dry climate on the west coast of South America. So here's that NASA image I talked about. And you can see the direction that sea surface water is being pushed. So here are those eddies I talked about. Right? You can see how the Gulf Stream meanders here quite dramatically. And then you have these little eddies that will break off. So ocean currents are very complex. And while they have major patterns that we've looked at today, right, there's lots of individual detail if you zoom into a particular region. But we can see here along the equator, this will be important for our next lecture. You can see how the color here, the temperature of the water, red being warm, right, green and blue being cold water, right? You can see how at the equator you have this massive push of water from the east to the west, right? And you don't see that push anywhere else. And we're going to come back to this next week when we talk about El Nino, because basically what happens during El Nino is this flips and suddenly surface water comes the opposite way towards South America instead of away. And when that happens, the climate flips, right? So they named it El Nino. Okay, so I'll leave that for next lecture because I think this presentation is a lot to absorb, and I want to make sure that you have the time to focus on a lot of these individual things. Okay, good luck on your quiz. Thank you.